The history we've been told about the past might be wrong. Many imagine that ancient times were peaceful, a period when tribes coexisted in harmony. But the truth is very different. War didn't start with organized armies or empires. It's embedded in the very essence of humanity since time immemorial. From the first clashes between different species to the earliest battles fought over territory and power, war has always been a decisive factor in the evolution of civilization. But what really drove our early ancestors to fight? Was it merely a matter of survival, or was there something deeper at play? And more importantly, how did these initial conflicts shape the destiny of the societies that followed? The answer is buried in archaeological sites, etched into cave paintings, and even reflected in the genetic codes we carry to this day. War wasn't just an event. It was a formative force, an invisible gear that propelled the formation of kingdoms, cities, and empires. Throughout this journey, we're going to explore how war evolved from impromptu skirmishes to meticulously planned battles that gave rise to the world's first civilizations. You'll learn how the need for defense led to the construction of fortifications, how rudimentary weapons transformed the way people fought, and how the instinct for domination molded social structures. And in the end, one unsettling question remains. Was war a mistake of humanity, or was it the key to our ascent? If you think war is merely a modern problem, get ready to think again. The history of humankind is a history of conflict, and understanding the past can help us see the present more clearly. So, join us on this investigation into the origins of war and discover how humanity's fate was forged on the battlefield. War has always been a ghost that haunts humanity, but just how far back do its roots go? In 1964, archaeologist Fred Wendorf made a discovery that would challenge established ideas about violence in ancient times. At the site of Jebel Sahaba, on the banks of the Nile, 61 graves were found, many showing clear signs of trauma caused by weapons. Arrows embedded in bones, lethal fractures, and repeated injuries pointed to a bloody past. Initially, it was thought that this was the stage for humanity's first organized battle, but new studies suggest a different pattern, not a conventional war, but rather an endless cycle of small-scale conflicts that plagued rival groups over time. Imagine living in a world where survival depended not only on hunting and shelter, but on constant vigilance against unexpected attacks. For the inhabitants of Jebel Sahaba, there were no uniformed armies or elaborate military strategies. It was the brutality of necessity, the instinct of self-defense. Small groups, possibly bands of hunter-gatherers, fought over territory, resources, and perhaps even revenge. The romantic notion of a peaceful ancient world crumbles when we look at the physical evidence. Arrowheads lodged in ribs, fractured skulls, and recurring attacks over centuries. This shows us that the embryo of war emerged long before the grand empires that would later dominate history. If these confrontations can't be classified as organized war, then what were they? Sporadic conflicts between tribes, perhaps strategic ambushes, or cyclical retaliations. And that raises an interesting question. Is violence a product of civilization or an intrinsic element of humanity? Judging by the evidence, these attacks weren't isolated incidents. Some skeletons bear signs of multiple injuries survived prior to death, suggesting that individuals were accustomed to facing constant threats. They weren't just victims of a one-off massacre. They were caught in a long history of bloodshed that would echo through the ages. It's impossible not to draw parallels with the empires that came later. If the struggle over territory and resources already existed in these primitive times, what really changed when more structured civilizations emerged? Only the scale. The instinct for survival still dictated the rules, but now the battles gained strategy, leadership, and eventually military organization. War ceased to be just a spontaneous reaction and became a mechanism of control. This leads us to another essential question. When exactly can we say that war, in its formal sense, began? And here lies one of history's greatest dilemmas. What really defines war? At what point does a conflict need to be organized to stop being a mere act of isolated violence and transform into an armed confrontation? The answer might not be so simple, but clues begin to emerge as we look into the past and understand how humanity learned to fight, defend itself, and eventually build empires based on military might. War is not just violent conflict. It's an organized phenomenon. To scholars, it's not enough for two or more parties to face off in hostility. There must be a collective purpose, a minimum structure, and leadership to coordinate the battles. War is the product of strategy, intention, and repetition. In the past, before the rise of great empires, early conflicts were likely ambushes or small disputes over territory, food, and revenge. But at some point, humanity took a step forward and transformed these chaotic fights into something more systematic and, consequently, more destructive. Imagine two rival groups of hunter-gatherers fighting over the same fertile valley. In the beginning, perhaps only a few individuals clashed in sporadic ambushes, but over time, the need for organization became clear. It was necessary to coordinate attacks, define roles, and identify leaders. What once was merely an instinctual struggle for survival began to take on a systematic character. And so, the first structured conflicts were born. Small bands started to act like rudimentary military units, anticipating enemy movements, choosing strategic locations to hide, and even refining their weapons. The difference between war and isolated. Violence can be subtle, but it's crucial. A fight between two men over food is not war. However, when a group begins to organize its actions, defining attack and defense strategies and thinking long-term, war starts to take shape. That's why military historians stress the importance of organization. War requires more than just weapons and a willingness to fight. It demands a plan. The exact moment when this transition occurred remains a mystery, but evidence suggests that in the very dawn of humanity, some tribes began to think like miniature armies. The first great civilizations would take this concept to a new level by creating permanent armies, war commanders, and military codes of conduct. But the initial steps toward war were taken long before that, when small groups realized that alone they were easy prey, but together they had power. From the moment humanity understood that strength lay in organization, its fate was sealed. The empires that would emerge thousands of years later didn't invent war. They simply perfected it. And that brings us to a fascinating dilemma. If war arises from organization, then it's not an accident, but a direct reflection of society's evolution. If the earliest battles emerged out of the need for control, what does that say about the future of humanity? This instinct for domination and conflict grew alongside civilization and shaped the world in irreversible ways. And if this path has been trodden since the most remote times, can war ever be completely eradicated? Has war always existed, or was it created by civilization? This question has divided thinkers for centuries. For figures like Thomas Hobbes and Winston Churchill, violence is an inevitable trait of humanity. According to Hobbes, man is born into a state of perpetual war, where life without order is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. On the other hand, Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that early humans lived in relative harmony and that war emerged as a consequence of social development and the struggle for power. Which view is correct? The archaeological evidence is beginning to provide an answer. If humanity was born peaceful, how do we explain fortifications, advanced weaponry, and remnants of battles in ancient times. Fortified settlements existed long before the empires, indicating that the fear of invaders was already part of the human mindset. Mass graves with signs of massacres show us that violence was not a rare occurrence, but a recurring event. Of course, this doesn't mean that the prehistoric world was a chaos of endless battles, but neither was it the peaceful paradise some imagined. The reality might lie somewhere in between. War may not be inevitable, but it has always been an option when resources ran scarce. The idea that man has always been in conflict makes sense when we look not only at human history, but at nature itself. Animals fight over territory, packs battle for leadership, and rival groups of primates engage in combat over food or dominance. If these behaviors occur in the animal kingdom, wouldn't it be logical that early humans also resolved their issues with brute force? Yet there's an important detail. Unlike animals, humans developed culture, strategies, and ambition. War ceased to be just a fight for survival. It became a means to conquer power, establish empires, and transform the world. What changed over the millennia was not the existence of conflict, but the way in which it was conducted. In the beginning, violence was spontaneous, without defined leaders or strategies. But as groups grew and societies became more complex, the need for military organization, alliances, and even rules of combat emerged. War became refined, gained purpose, and ironically, turned into an instrument of civilization. The first ancient empires, such as Egypt and Mesopotamia, quickly grasped this and used war not only for defense, but to expand their dominion. Whether war was born with man or with civilization might not be as important as its consequences. What matters is that since the earliest days of humanity, violence has been present, either as a necessity or as a choice. But when exactly did war cease to be merely a reflection of human nature and become a structured element of society? The next step on this journey through history takes us to one of the most enigmatic events of the past: the first conflicts between different species. If there's one thing history teaches us, it's that war doesn't only happen between nations, it happens between species too. Long before the great empires of antiquity, a silent conflict was underway. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals coexisted for thousands of years, but one of them vanished. Could it have been a war between these species that determined the fate of humanity? Evidence from the Shanidar cave in present-day Iraq suggests that Neanderthals may have been attacked with thrown spears, weapons typical of Homo sapiens. This discovery raises an unsettling question. What if the ancestors of modern man simply exterminated the Neanderthals? That hypothesis isn't far-fetched. Neanderthals were physically stronger, but Homo sapiens had something that made all the difference: strategic intelligence and adaptability. In a contest over territory and resources, these factors are decisive. If war already existed between tribes of the same species, it's not hard to imagine that two very different groups competing for the same space would eventually come into conflict. This brings us to an essential point. War didn't begin with armies or kings, but with small groups fighting for survival. And in that contest, the sapiens showed that besides having sharp weapons, they possessed something even deadlier: the ability to plan and cooperate. But would it be fair to say that there was premeditated extermination? Some scientists argue that the Neanderthals were simply outcompeted for food and territory. The fact remains that as Homo sapiens spread, the Neanderthals disappeared. A coincidence? Highly unlikely. There's evidence that sapiens had more efficient hunting technology, more sophisticated communication, and even more structured social organization. If that was enough to wipe out an entire group, the answer might be buried in fossils and tools left behind. Moreover, there's a fascinating detail. Many of us carry Neanderthal genes. This suggests that at some point, these two species not only fought, but also intermingled. Is it possible that the war between them wasn't solely physical, but also cultural? Perhaps sapiens absorbed some Neanderthals into their tribes, while others were eliminated. This pattern, by the way, would repeat itself many times throughout human history, empires absorbing conquered peoples, blending customs, and creating new identities. War is often more than mere destruction, it's transformation, and if that conflict between species helped shape the early steps of humanity, what about the war within our own species? As sapiens advanced and began forming societies, the confrontation was no longer limited to surviving against other species. Now, it was time to fight among themselves. But how did military organization arise? When did the first groups realize that defending themselves with strategies, not just brute force, was possible? The answer might be found in the earliest fortified settlements, where war became a pillar of civilization. With the end of nomadic life and the rise of permanent villages, a new problem emerged: how to protect oneself from invaders. Whereas survival once depended on fleeing or fighting, it now required ensuring that crops and food supplies wouldn't be looted. That's how the first fortifications were born. The city of Jericho, for example, built its walls around 8000 BC, long before the empires of antiquity. These structures weren't just physical barriers, they were a clear warning that war was already a part of humanity's new reality. The mere fact that a city erected walls reveals something important. The fear of war already existed. If there were no enemies, why build defenses? And we're not talking about makeshift defenses either. Some of these early fortifications featured watchtowers, narrow entrances to hinder invasions, and even moats. Neolithic peoples quickly learned that in war, strategy is as important as strength. A well-defended city could hold out for weeks, while an unprotected group was quickly destroyed. It was the beginning of a concept that would define future empires: security as the foundation of power. But it wasn't just the walls that changed the game. Geography itself became a strategic factor. Many settlements were built atop hills or surrounded by rivers, making attacks more difficult. If a rival tribe wanted to conquer a territory, they had to find a way to overcome these natural and man-made barriers. This led to the refinement of siege tactics and consequently the evolution of military strategy. What started as a simple need for defense soon turned into a game of intelligence and adaptation, something that empires like the Romans would master centuries later. These walled cities also had a psychological impact. The sight of an imposing fortress served as a deterrent to many would-be attackers. Who would risk attacking a city with formidable defenses without being sure of victory? Thus, the walls not only provided physical protection, but also helped avert unnecessary conflicts. This shows us that from the very beginning, war wasn't just about fighting. The perception of power was equally essential. Civilizations that understood this thrived, while those that neglected defense became easy targets for raiders. Yet, if cities began to protect themselves, they also needed to find ways to attack. It wasn't enough to simply withstand enemy assaults, it was necessary to defeat them. And so, the first offensive strategies emerged, ranging from ambushes to prolonged sieges. But how did early humans start planning battles? When did war stop being merely a matter of survival and begin to involve tactics and organization? The answer may lie in the earliest depictions of warfare painted on cave walls. Long before history books were written, before empires chronicled their conquests, war was recorded in another way: on cave walls. Rock paintings found in Spain, dating back to around 5000 BC, depict groups of archers in combat. These drawings are the first visual evidence that war wasn't just an isolated phenomenon, It was an event significant enough to be immortalized. Our ancestors wouldn't have depicted anything that wasn't essential to their survival or culture. If they chose to represent battles, it was because those battles shaped their world. The presence of these illustrations suggests something fascinating. Ancient wars weren't simply disorganized brawls, but rather fights with a degree of strategy. In the drawings, you can see formations of warriors shooting arrows, indicating that there was some level of coordination. This completely changes our perception of the earliest conflicts. They weren't just impulsive bursts of violence, they were planned. Just as hunters used tactics to corner prey, early warriors utilized their environment to their advantage, attacking in groups to maximize their chances of victory. And this raises an interesting question. Were these depictions merely records, or did they serve a greater purpose? Some theories propose that these drawings were used to teach future generations about war tactics as a rudimentary visual manual. In a world without writing, images were the most effective way to pass on knowledge. If a tribe mastered certain techniques of attack and defense, it needed to ensure that its descendants learned them too. This shows us that war wasn't something that just happened. It was something that was taught. War became so embedded in everyday life that it turned into part of the culture and, eventually, the identity of peoples. Some of these records not only show the battle itself, but also the trophies of victory, fallen enemies or warriors posed in triumphant stances. This need to display power and dominance was already evident, a behavior that future empires, like the Egyptians and Romans, would transform into military propaganda. The victorious warrior wasn't just a survivor. He was a symbol, a hero, an inspiration to others. But if there was already strategic thinking behind warfare, what about the weapons used in these battles? Bows, spears, sharpened stones, tools that might seem simple, but changed the course of conflicts. And as these weapons evolved, so too did the methods of combat. After all, war isn't won by courage alone. The technology has always been a decisive factor. The next step in humanity's journey in the art of war would come with the invention and refinement of the first lethal weapons. War has never been solely about brute strength. From the very beginning, the difference between victory and defeat lay in the technology of weapons. During the Neolithic, the bow and arrow, sling, club and spear became essential tools for survival and domination over enemies. Among these, the bow was revolutionary. For the first time, it allowed one to attack without having to get close to the adversary. That changed everything. War shifted from being a melee brawl to a contest of range, precision, and strategy. Whoever mastered the bow held a clear advantage over his foes. Strategically, the bow made warfare more dynamic. Imagine a group of warriors sheltering behind fortifications, firing arrows at unprotected attackers. It was nearly impossible to win a battle without mounting an adequate counterattack. That's when the spear began to carve out its space as one of the most versatile weapons of antiquity. When thrown, it delivered immense destructive power. In close combat, it allowed a warrior to strike while keeping a safe distance from the enemy. Armies that managed to combine these weapons dominated the earliest territorial disputes. Another underestimated yet incredibly lethal tool was the sling. A simple strip of leather or plant fiber used to hurl stones at terrifying speeds. In trained hands, a sling could kill a man instantly. To put its potential in perspective, in later times, warriors specialized in its use, such as the Babylonian and Roman slingers, would become key components in military formations. This was proof that war didn't rely solely on having the largest number of soldiers, but on who had the greatest mastery of their weapons. The impact of these technologies was so profound that we can draw parallels with the great empires that emerged later. The Egyptians, for example, made the bow one of the pillars of their military strength. The Hittites perfected the spear with the aid of cavalry. The Romans created entire formations based on the efficiency of long-range weapons and close combat. All of this began in the Neolithic, when small groups realized that war wasn't won by muscle alone, but by intelligence and innovation. Yet powerful weapons were useless without prepared warriors. Over time, war evolved from being a momentary necessity into an essential part of social structure. Warrior clans emerged, entire tribes became experts in combat, and society itself began to revolve around those who possessed military power. This leads us to one of the most intriguing mysteries of ancient history, a period when men were decimated on a massive scale, leaving only the fittest to fight. About 7,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened in human history, a genetic enigma that still intrigues scientists today. Studies of the Y chromosome, which is passed exclusively from father to son, reveal a drastic reduction in male genetic diversity. It appears that at some point, the majority of men simply vanished, leaving only a few dominant lineages. What could have caused such an extreme phenomenon? The most likely answer: intense clan warfare. Survival of the fittest wasn't just a matter of skill, but of military might. Imagine living in an era where war wasn't just a possibility, but a constant. Clans clashed repeatedly, fighting over territory, resources, and supremacy. In these brutal battles, the winners not only defeated their enemies, they often exterminated them, erasing entire lineages. Only the men from the most powerful clans survived, passing on their genes and consolidating their dominance. War thus became a genetic filter, selecting not only the strongest warriors, but also the most strategic. This extreme competition for survival shaped not just genetics, but also the social structure of future civilizations. The figure of the warrior became central. Clans organized their lives around military leaders, and combat skills determined status and prestige. It's no wonder that centuries later, ancient empires glorified their generals, erected monuments to celebrate battles, and carved their victories in stone. War molded collective identity and dictated the rules of life's game. Interestingly, this intense selection also had a side effect: the formation of highly organized societies. To win battles, sheer strength wasn't enough. Discipline, coordination, and planning were required. Clans that mastered the art of war became benchmarks, inspiring the formation of city-states and eventually empires. War not only destroyed, it created. It forged new power structures, new alliances, and of course, new conflicts. The cycle seemed endless, with each victory planting the seed for the next conflict. And so, as humanity approached a new millennium, war was no longer merely a matter of survival, but a political tool, a method of expansion, and a demonstration of power. We were on the verge of witnessing the birth of the first truly organized wars, fought by armies under the command of kings and generals. And these monumental conflicts would not only shape the destiny of entire civilizations, but also define the future of humanity. But when did war become an organizing force in society? When did the first empires hoist their banners over battlefields, setting the course for history? If early conflicts were mere tribal disputes, by the end of the Neolithic War had already become an organizing force in societies. Around 3000 BC, humanity took a giant leap forward, the creation of the first organized armies. Cities grew, resources became fiercely contested, and the need to protect territories gave rise to increasingly structured combats. It was the beginning of a new era, where war was no longer an occasional event, but a central factor in the fate of peoples. Whoever mastered the art of war mastered the world. That was the moment when tribes transformed into kingdoms and kingdoms into empires. Mesopotamia witnessed the birth of the first city-states like Ur and Lagash, which frequently clashed to expand their lands and influence. In Egypt, the concept of a permanent army began to take shape, and the pharaohs soon realized that ruling wasn't enough. It was necessary to conquer. In every corner of the ancient world, one truth became clear. War wasn't just a means of survival, but a tool of power. The professionalization of combat brought with it new tactics and technologies. Warriors were no longer simple hunters or farmers with improvised weapons. They became trained, organized, and led by experienced commanders. Bronze started to be used in making stronger swords and spears, while chariots began to appear on battlefields. War ceased to be just a reflection of necessity and turned into a spectacle of strategy and innovation. The influence of war extended far beyond the battlefield. It shaped culture, economy, and politics. Rulers legitimized themselves through conquest. Temples were built in honor of the gods of war, and populations were mobilized to support military campaigns. The idea of an empire began to take form, and with it came an inescapable reality. As one people grew and prospered, they inevitably clashed with another. The cycle of rise and fall, fueled by war, became a constant in human history. Thus, the first civilizations began to understand that war wasn't merely about destruction, it was also about creation. It established borders, forged heroes, and gave birth to myths, but it also brought challenges, betrayals, and unexpected twists. War was on the verge of becoming the main driving force in history, molding kingdoms, building empires, and leaving scars that would echo for millennia. But how did these first empires emerge? How did war stop being an isolated event and become the backbone of entire civilizations? The answer lies in the first great kingdoms that ruled the land, taking war to a level never seen before. War shaped humanity in ways we don't always recognize. From the earliest ambushes among tribes to the rise of monumental empires, conflicts were not only destructive, they were also the engine of progress. What would have happened if early peoples hadn't learned to defend themselves? If they hadn't developed weapons, strategies, and alliances? Perhaps civilization as we know it would never have existed. And that brings us to a disturbing question. Was war a necessary evil for the world to get to where it is today? When we look at history, one thing becomes clear. Whenever one empire fell, another rose from its ashes. Rome grew out of the ruins of Carthage. The Mongols conquered Eurasia and imposed their own order, and every civilization that emerged had to fight for its space. But can this cycle of war and ascension ever be broken? Or like our ancestors, are we just waiting for the next big conflict? Now that you know the roots of war, the question remains, what can we learn from it? Is human nature doomed to conflict? Or does history show us an alternative path? Reflect on that and consider how the battles of the past still echo in today's world. After all, the strategies, alliances, and power plays remain the same. Only the names and weapons have changed. And if you want to keep unraveling the mysteries of history and understand how past events influence the present, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We have so much more to explore, and the most astonishing stories are yet to come. See you in the next video.